Hi, this is Miss Hadi. I want to share with you about post-classical India for my class and Mr. Ham's classes at Olympian High School. The lecture's on the left and the book notes are on the right. One thing to keep in mind is that the northern kingdoms that we studied in a previous lecture video are going to be a lot more chaotic than what we're going to see in the south. So here's India. This is what's called the South Asian Indian subcontinent, South Asian subcontinent. So we're in South Asia. Okay, what we saw earlier was the temporary restoration of imperial rule with King Harsha's kingdom, and between these two blue bands was the Sultanate of Delhi that I told you was a Muslim kingdom. Here's the Sind. Now we're going to look down at the south, and there's two major kingdoms that we're going to study. That does not mean they were the only two kingdoms around at the time. So there are other kingdoms. We're just not going to study them. So one of the things that the book tries to emphasize for you is that the southern part of the Indian subcontinent was not as tumultuous as the north was, the northern part of India. In the south, you have mostly Hindu rulers, although there is going to be an attempt to impose Muslim rule in the south, but you have mostly Hindu rulers ruling over smaller regional states. And they competed between themselves, and so that ended up with a lot of regional wars. You do have some regional states that started to expand, but could not get strong enough to overpower the others. The first kingdom that I want you to know about is the Chole Kingdom, which lasts for about 4 centuries, so for about 400 years. And it was a very strong maritime power, and it controlled maritime trade, which allowed it to expand into Ceylon, parts of Southeast Asia. It was more interested in benefiting from control over trade than it really was in necessarily becoming a powerful political state, and it was much less centralized than other states that we've studied. So we want to think of it as having a loose institutional structure, again, interested in dominating trade, not very tightly centralized, so different from other states that we've studied. Eventually, though, it's going to face rebellions by native Sinhalese people in Ceylon and have other regional kingdoms attack it, and it's going to revert back to a small kingdom, although for a little while it seemed like it might be able to expand and become a stronger, more centralized state. The second kingdom that I want you to know about in the south is the kingdom of Jaynagar. It has an interesting start. It was started by an attempt by the Sultanate of Delhi to consolidate control over this region before Turkish people might try to take over. And so they sent two brothers, Harihara and Buka, who had converted to Islam, to come there and represent the Sultan and try to implement the Sultanate of Delhi's policies in the south. Well, Harihara and Buka, although they had converted, were really more Hindu. And so when they got to the south, they sensed an opportunity to rule in their own name. And so they renounced or gave up their faith in Islam, went back to their traditional Hinduism, and created a Hindu empire, an independent empire, independent of the Sultanate of Delhi in the north between these two bands. And it was called the Kingdom of Vijayanagar, or the City of Victory. So this is a coup. You don't say the P in this word. So this is a change over in power, but it does not have what you would expect, the hostility between the Muslim north, the Sultanate of Delhi, and the Kingdom of Jaynagar in the south. Did not lead to diminished trade between the two kingdoms. Eventually, the kingdom of Jayanagar is going to fall to an alliance of Muslim kingdoms that overthrow it. But for a little while, it provides political stability in the south. So again, the book makes a big point of emphasizing that India did not have a large-scale centralized imperial state, a big state like we saw in other parts of the world. For example, like we saw in the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasty in Southwest Asia, the Byzantine Empire in the Mediterranean, or the Sui-Tong Song in China. So these kingdoms that we're studying, especially in the south, were nowhere near as powerful as those other states, and they couldn't rule over such a wider area, but they did provide some coherence to what society looked like, and they did have some structures that they adopted that provided cohesion to post-classical India. Again, we're not going to see centralized imperial rule until the rise of the Mughals, which is much later in the 1500s. So think of the kingdoms of the south as being Hindu, less centralized.